You are an Ottoman soldier. The march has been weeks long. At dawn the wind turns, and with it comes something you have not smelled since crossing the Danube. The thick, metallic tang of blood, the sweet rot that hangs over a battlefield long after the killing ends. Then you see them, thin silhouettes against a low sun, hundreds of upright poles, each crowned by a human shape. They are not corpses neatly buried or hastily stacked. They are held open, exposed, arranged like a sinister orchard. Some stare with mouths frozen in a final scream. Some are gaunt and shrunken, as if time itself were draining them where they hang. A child's small boot dangles from a stake. A turban, nailed to a skull, flaps in the breeze. The column falters. Men whisper. The drums fall silent. What happened to Ottoman prisoners under Vlad the Impaler? And why did the sight of them unmake an entire campaign? This is not a tale of insanity or superstition. It is the record of deliberate, engineered terror, a strategy that turned human suffering into a weapon. What you are about to hear is how a boy raised in the shadow of the Ottoman court learned to convert humiliation into policy, how he returned to Wallachia and remade justice into spectacle, and how a battlefield display changed the course of a summer in 1462. If you want more deep dives into the dark mechanics of history, subscribe. There's more like this ahead. We begin with the young prince. Vlad III, later known to history as Vlad the Impaler, was born into a region of knives and shifting loyalties. Wallachia sat at the crossroads of empires, hung between Hungary and the expanding Ottoman state. His father, Vlad II Dracul, belonged to the Order of the Dragon, a knightly fraternity sworn to defend Christendom. But he was also a pragmatic prince who paid tribute and offered sons as hostages when the balance of power demanded it. In 1442, when Vlad was roughly 11, the Ottoman court took him and his younger brother Radu as political collateral. Hostage is a deceptively gentle word. In the 15th century it meant more than custody. It was a form of political education. The Ottoman palace and military world were a crucible. Boys from diverse lands learned language, administration, military drill, and the strict hierarchies that sustained imperial rule. They attended executions. They observed the choreography of punishment. They were exposed to rituals of humiliation and power that made obedience legible. For some, it produced loyal functionaries. For others, it compounded a sense of alienation and grievance. Vlad's years in the Ottoman orbit are essential for understanding what came after. Contemporary accounts, Turkish chronicles, Byzantine observers, later Western pamphlets, agree on an outline. He lived at court, received training, and endured episodes of deprivation and discipline that left scars on his psyche. To be clear, the records are fragmentary, and motives are slippery. But the pattern is consistent enough that modern historians see in his captivity a formative crucible. The Ottoman practice of incorporating hostage princes into the imperial system taught Vlad both the mechanics of power and the language of public violence. Why would exposure to public execution produce a ruler who weaponized suffering? Because what he learned at court was not only how to wield a sword, but how to make obedience automatic. Public punishment was lesson and warning at once. It taught subjects where the boundary between life and death lay, and it displayed the costs of crossing it. For Vlad, this lesson mutated from demonstration into doctrine. Fear, in his view, was not merely repressive, it was productive. Fear could deter rivals, secure labor, and reorder a fractious nobility whose loyalties were porous. When circumstances finally allowed him to seize the Wallachian throne, Vlad returned not as a student of Ottoman manners, but as a man determined to remake his polity. The state he inherited was riven by powerful boyar families, landed magnates who had long treated the prince's authority as negotiable. Corruption, collusion, and assassinations were routine. Succession itself had been a bloody business. In that environment, a ruler with a fragile power base faced two options: build alliances or break the old order. Vlad chose the latter, and he did so by turning spectacle into instrument. The coronation feast offers the clearest example of his method. Contemporary chroniclers, some Hungarian, some Saxon, and later sensational pamphleteers, record an event that reads like a political purge disguised as hospitality. According to several sources, Vlad invited a number of boyars, ostensibly to celebrate his accession. During the meal, he and his men sealed the exits. When his chosen signal rang out, the invited nobles were seized. Some were executed on the spot. Others were given a choice: walk before a line of impaled bodies, rebuild parts of a ruined fortress, or suffer immediate death. The implication was unmistakable. The prince controlled not only bloody force, but the narrative of punishment. This story has been embroidered and debated. Saxon and later Western pamphlets, circulating in the same year as the events, pushed lurid details into the public imagination. Images of feasts with blood-soaked bread and heads set on plates. These accounts were intended to terrify and to discredit. Their authors had political motives. Still, the core idea that Vlad used the ceremonial space of a feast to decapitate or neutralize political rivals fits with other, less sensational records. It reveals a ruler who understood the power of ritualized violence to remake social relations. Vlad's policy toward the boyars was not merely punitive, it was administrative. Those selected for destruction were often those whose independence threatened central authority. The old grandees with private armies, the men who sold privileges to the highest bidder. Other nobles were not killed outright, but reduced to dependency. They were tasked with forced labor, rebuilding fortresses, cutting roads, repairing defenses, work that simultaneously benefited the state and humiliated the former elite. The fortress of Poenari became the epicenter of this program, a citadel perched on a steep, rocky outcrop, where prisoners and coerced laborers worked in harsh conditions to restore its walls and terraces. Here, too, sources vary in tone and emphasis. Some chroniclers present Poenari almost as an engineering project, a defensive necessity. Others emphasize the human cost. The truth lies in the overlap. Vlad used construction and coerced labor as tools of consolidation. The men who rebuilt the fort were marked. They had seen what happened to obstinate nobles, and they understood that their labor made the prince indispensable. If domestic consolidation remade elites by making obedience visible, impalement remade the public imagination. To speak clinically, impalement, as reported in contemporary descriptions, was an intentionally prolonged mode of execution. It differs from battlefield killing or the beheading of a condemned criminal. Its aim was not swift death, but extended, demonstrable suffering. The method most often described by near-contemporary sources involved a wooden stake sharpened at the tip and sometimes slightly blunted to avoid immediate decapitation. The stake was sometimes inserted through the rectum and angled upward. The body would then be suspended, either impaled onto the stake or lashed so that gravity and exposure contributed to a slow demise. Variations existed, and not every execution followed the exact same steps. Some accounts mention stakes driven through other parts of the body. Others record strangulation before impalement. The common denominator in the reports is duration and visibility. Let us be cautious here. The precise mechanics, as recorded, are contested and colored by the rhetoric of sources. Saxon pamphlets and later sensational chronicles amplify the cruelty to make a moral point. Ottoman records, when available, sometimes use different language or avoid graphic detail entirely. Modern historians debate whether every element frequently reported was standard practice, or merely the product of rumor. What is clear, however, is that impalement was designed to be public and pedagogical. The stake was a signpost as much as a device. Staging mattered as much as technique. Vlad positioned his impaled prisoners where they would be seen, on causeways, at crossroads, fence lines along major approaches to towns, and clustered in rows near the gates of Târgoviște, his capital. Height was symbolic. Taller stakes were said to hold higher-ranking victims. A family could be punished together, wives above, children among the lower ranks of the display, creating a tableau of collective ruin. Mutilation and humiliation augmented the message. There are reports, marked in the sources as contested, that turbans were nailed to skulls to dishonor Ottoman identity, or that severed hands and feet were displayed to advertise the fate of thieves. These anecdotes vary in reliability and are sometimes clearly the products of propaganda. Editor note: source attribution on screen, e.g., source Saxon pamphlet, 1462, probable propaganda. Why would a ruler go to such lengths? The calculus was strategic. The sight of living men exposed and lingering taught three lessons simultaneously. First, it deterred resistance by making the costs of defiance vividly imaginable. Second, it broke morale among the enemy by imposing a moral and psychological burden. Third, it consolidated central power by signaling to the local elite that the prince alone controlled life and death. In short, spectacle functioned as policy. This was not a tactic limited to domestic politics. When Mehmed II, already famed for taking Constantinople in 1453, advanced with a major force toward Wallachia in the summer of 1462, Vlad translated his policy of terror into a theater of war. The Sultan's campaign that year sought to punish Wallachia for its refusal to pay tribute and its reported depredations on Ottoman supply lines. Mehmed brought a vast army, estimated in contemporary and near-contemporary sources in tens of thousands. The exact size is debated. Ottoman chronicles and European observers give different figures, and modern scholarship ranges widely. What matters is the psychological dominance the Sultan expected numbers to provide. Against that expectation, Vlad adopted a multi-pronged defense, scorched earth tactics, targeted night raids, and a campaign to make the battlefield itself a message. Scorched earth was not simply wanton destruction, it was strategic denial. Supplies, grain, forage, livestock were burned or driven away. Bridges were destroyed. Villages were emptied. The aim was to starve the invaders' logistics. An army moves on food and fodder. No amount of valor can cross an empty plain without supply. Vlad paired these measures with a form of guerrilla warfare adapted to the political landscape. His men, many familiar with local passes and forests, conducted nocturnal strikes, small, precise operations aimed at commanders' tents, at baggage trains, at supply depots. Contemporary accounts highlight a particular night attack on June 17th, in which Vlad's forces nearly reached Mehmed's own encampment. Men slipped through palisades, struck at watchfires, and created chaos in the Sultan's rear. Whether they intended to kill the Sultan or simply to terrorize and disorganize is debated. What is not in dispute is the effect. Mehmed felt vulnerable. That night proved the logic of Vlad's equation. Fear could magnify tactical advantage, but terror, to be effective, needs spectacle. It needs to be visible and legible, hence the culmination of Vlad's strategy, the forest of the impaled. As Mehmed's army approached the region around Târgoviște, scouts reported a landscape transformed. Roads were empty, houses were smoke-blackened husks. Along the approaches, where once stood hedgerows and orchards, poles sprouted like a second crop. Accounts differ on the numbers. Some Western pamphlets, explicitly propagandistic, claimed tens of thousands of stakes bearing bodies stretched for miles. Ottoman chroniclers tended not to provide such lurid tallies, focusing instead on the psychological blow. Modern historians urge caution. Exaggerated numbers served readers and bidders for political advantage, and the logistics of impaling extremely large numbers present practical limits. A cautious reconstruction suggests that the display, while real and extensive, was likely in the hundreds to low thousands rather than the enormous figures asserted by some contemporaries. The important point is not a precise number, but the visual and moral magnitude, an engineered scene designed to feel limitless. Imagine again that you are in the Sultan's camp. It is midsummer. The road ahead twists into a valley. Your scouts bring you first the smell, then the sight. A corridor of stakes, a forest not of trees, but of human bodies. The mood shifts. Soldiers who had been confident now clutch their standards more tightly. Some hawks who called for engagement before now counsel caution. The colonel who argued for immediate pursuit becomes thoughtful, because he has seen what the campaign might cost and what the enemy is willing to endure. Mehmed's reaction is instructive, and here several sources converge in tone, if not in detail. He was a commander versed in siegecraft and bold assault. Yet even he knew that an army's cohesion depends on morale. Psychologically, the forest of the impaled presented a problem beyond the purely military. If the enemy could transform prisoners, human beings who should have been exchanged, ransomed, or held, into a spectacle of unending suffering, the moral calculus of war changed. The Sultan faced a choice: accept the psychological cost and attempt to impose order, or withdraw and regroup, leaving behind an image that would haunt the memory of the campaign. It would be an error, however, to treat Vlad's tactics as merely theatrical. They were tightly integrated with practical goals. By terrorizing the populace and creating a landscape of visible punishment, he not only dissuaded collaboration with the Ottoman army, but also forced the invader to confront the prospect of a long, attritional campaign with no secure lines of supply. The winter would come. Supply convoys would be vulnerable. The longer Mehmed lingered, the more vulnerable his logistics became. Terror was therefore not only psychological, but logistical, an amplifier of scarcity. But terror also carries entropy. The methods that consolidate power through fear can, if left unchecked, erode legitimacy and ally support. Within Wallachia, reports suggest that the use of impalement and forced labor, once tools of consolidation, later metastasized into instruments of personal cruelty and capriciousness. Allies, including Hungary under Matthias Corvinus, watched with a mixture of relief and alarm. Corvinus had his own geopolitical priorities and sometimes preferred a pliant Wallachian prince. For foreign merchants, such as the Saxon merchants of Brasov and Sibiu, Vlad's measures threatened trade and the fragile networks of commerce that sustained regional stability. These economic and diplomatic strains mattered because a ruler who terrifies his population can find himself isolated when he most needs allies. As Mehmed's encampment drew nearer, the Ottoman command confronted another problem: the cost of a punitive conquest versus the price of withdrawing with honor. Historical records, again varied in their emphases, suggest that Mehmed ultimately chose to withdraw rather than to launch a full-scale assault on a devastated country, at least in part, because the combined effect of scorched earth, raids, and the spectacle of impalement made victory costly and uncertain. Yet this was not a simple victory for Vlad. The retreat was strategic, not absolute. Supply lines could, in theory, be re-established. A new campaign could be mounted. And the moral and political costs for Wallachia were profound: depopulation, economic ruin, and the fraying of social bonds. There is irony here. Weaponized terror achieved a narrow, immediate objective: disruption, deterrence, the stinging of an invading army. But it also sowed seeds of long-term instability. Vlad's domestic program of fear, which had once seemed to secure his rule, began to exact a toll on the very institutions he needed: the loyalty of local magnates, the goodwill of foreign merchants, and the respect of potential allies. The use of impalement and public executions made dissent rarer, but it also hollowed out consent. Complicating the picture are the stories that lodged in public imagination and later swelled into legend. Tales of Vlad dining amid the impaled, of foreign turbans nailed to skulls, of heads sent in baskets to victims' families. Each of these images traveled across Europe, translated into woodcuts, pamphlets, and rumor. They served political ends, to vilify, to warn, to excite. Scholars continue to debate how many of these images reflect eyewitness reality and how many are rhetorical constructions. Where possible, we mark such episodes as reported by particular sources and consider their motives. Editor note: on-screen citation. Reported by Saxon Pamphlet, 1462, likely exaggerated. Even as propaganda amplified horror, Vlad's own enemies weaponized the narrative. Hungarian and Saxon informants had reasons to emphasize savagery. Ottoman chroniclers, in turn, could use such stories as proof of Ottoman moral superiority or as a cautionary tale for their own troops. The battlefield thus became as much a contest of images as of men. We are now at the point where the armies meet in effect, if not in close combat. The Sultan halted. The scouts returned with accounts that read like the opening scene of this story, and a tension settled across the valley. The choice before Mehmed: press on through a landscape of deliberately manufactured horror or recalibrate his objectives, would have cascading effects. Would he burn deeper into Wallachian territory, risking attrition and morale, or would he accept strategic limits, punish where he could through raids, and withdraw to fight another day? To appreciate the stakes, we must return to human scale. The men on those stakes were not abstractions. Some were prisoners captured in raids, some were alleged thieves or traitors, and others were people chosen to exemplify a rule. The Ottoman Empire, like all pre-modern polities, expected warfare to have rules. Ransom, exchange, and negotiated settlements were part of the social economy of war. By converting prisoners into an unending public statement, Vlad disrupted that economy. He made the treatment of captive bodies a question of politics rather than merely property, a signal that his polity would not abide by negotiated settlement when the alternative was public domination. There are practical details worth noting, often overlooked in sensational accounts. Impaling hundreds or even thousands of people is not a trivial enterprise. It requires manpower, wood, logistics, and time. It requires guards and resources to prevent rescues. The very fact that Vlad could sustain such displays points to deliberate planning and resource allocation. This was state action, not random cruelty by a gang. At the same time, the logistical strain on his own realm cannot be dismissed. Maintaining large impalements and the system of terror they represented demanded resources that might have been used elsewhere, another dimension of the strategic cost. As the Sultan's scouts crested the last ridge and the columns filed into view, officers fell silent. The first line of stakes filled the horizon. Some of the more seasoned commanders, men who had besieged cities and taken fortresses, felt something else: recognition. They had seen fear used before. They had seen cities cowed by displays. But the scale here was different. The display was personal and relentless. The moral machinery of empire had been asked to process something brutal and local. And the question that haunted the commanders was not merely tactical. Could an army carry the weight of a campaign when the landing zone itself had been turned into a museum of human suffering? At this critical moment, choices congealed into decisions. The narrative we have followed, boyhood captivity, a prince remade by humiliation, domestic consolidation through spectacle, the tactical translation of terror into military strategy, arrived at a hinge. Whether the Sultan would advance, whether he would call it off, whether Vlad's work would stand as a warning or become the ruin of the land he ruled, all turned on the reactions of a few men in a tent. But the consequences would ripple far beyond the immediate present. There is more to unravel. The private toll on Wallachia, the shifting alliances with Hungary, the later capture and imprisonment of Vlad himself, and the ways in which his memory would be reshaped into myth and monster. There are also technical questions to pursue. How precisely impalement was carried out across different cases, the range of contemporary numerical claims and their biases, and the contested anecdotes that traveled into pamphlets and art. Above all, the story forces us to ask a fundamental question. When does deterrence become disease? When does a method that wins battles undermine the polity that wields it? We will return to these threads, to the fate of prisoners beyond the battlefield, to the subtle calculus of European politics that left Vlad isolated, and to the aftermath that placed his head on a platter in Istanbul some years later, according to certain Ottoman sources. For now, the valley remains full of Poles, and the wind still carries that bitter metallic tang. Men in the Sultan's camp close their eyes and weigh the price of pressing forward. Reported anecdotes and extreme figures are contested, editorial on-screen citation recommended where specific pamphlets or chronicles are referenced. The stakes in the valley did more than slow an army. They rewired a set of expectations about what happened to prisoners in wartime. What exactly befell Ottoman captives under Vlad's rule? The short, stark answer: many were turned into instruments of state terror, executed by impalement and left on display, pressed into punitive labor, or otherwise repurposed to serve a political message. But the fuller story matters because it shows how a policy aimed at deterrence bled into something more destructive, and why contemporaries, Ottoman, Hungarian, Saxon, and later European readers, found the spectacle not only shocking, but politically consequential. First, the battlefield captures. When Vlad's men raided Ottoman columns, they took prisoners, soldiers, camp followers, sometimes scouts or foragers. In pre-modern warfare, captives were normally a kind of portable asset, ransomed, exchanged, or enslaved. Vlad disrupted that economy. Instead of moving prisoners through a market of value, he often placed them where everyone could see. Some captured Ottoman soldiers were impaled along the lines of approach. Others were set out at crossroads or beside rebuilt fortifications to make the cost of invasion legible. In military terms, this was a message. In human terms, it was a transformation. A prisoner ceased to be a bargaining chip and became a tableau. Not every prisoner met the same fate. Contemporary records suggest a range of outcomes. Some captives, especially low-ranking fighters or suspected thieves, could be forced into labor to rebuild fortifications like Ponari, or to clear roads and gather timber for stakes. Forced labor served two functions. It replenished material needs created by scorched earth tactics, and it publicly reclassified subordinates as workers under prince and state. Other prisoners, especially those taken during raids meant to terrify or to punish collaboration, were executed by impalement and left in place as a visible rule. The visible calculus was crude but functional. If a captive's death could reduce future resistance among locals and enemies, then death was a resource. The choice to impale prisoners had both practical and symbolic elements. Practically, impalement was a statement that a man would not simply vanish into a dungeon or return ransomed. His suffering would be part of a public pedagogy. Symbolically, executing captives in this way violated norms that many contemporaries took for granted. The expectation that prisoners could be exchanged or ransomed. That violation itself was weaponized. It signaled that surrender or capture did not guarantee preservation, thereby raising the stakes of engagement for the enemy. An Ottoman soldier, who knew he might be taken and then displayed alive on a stake, faced a different calculus than one who expected ransom. The historiographical landscape here is knotty. Some Western pamphlets and Saxon writers from Brasov and Sibiu embellished accounts, reporting scenes so lurid that modern scholars treat them as partisan amplification. Yet it would be a mistake to dismiss all claims as mere propaganda. Ottoman chronicles, Hungarian letters and local accounts converge on enough elements, impalement is practiced, displays at approaches, forced labor at fortresses, to make it clear that prisoners were frequently repurposed into tools of governance and war. The scale, however, remains contested. The numbers bandied about in 16th century broadsides are not reliable. Editorial cue: show on-screen attribution where pamphlet details are used, e.g., the source, Saxon pamphlet, 1462, likely exaggerated. Beyond those immediate effects, Vlad's treatment of captives had diplomatic reverberations. Ransoming and exchanging prisoners formed a thread of cross-border etiquette. Merchants and envoys relied on these practices. Kings counted on them as a way to avoid endless feuding. By subverting that thread, Vlad not only terrorized the Ottomans, but also worried neighbors and trade partners. Saxon merchants complained that the insecurity his methods created degraded commerce. Hungarian diplomats fretted that Walachia's rule was too unpredictable to trust. In short, turning prisoners into scenery solved one problem, deterrence, but created others, isolating the state in the diplomatic marketplace when allies mattered. There is also the matter of moral contagion. Within Wallachia, methods devised to intimidate external foes bled into domestic practice. Impalement, once a tool to punish traitors and deter boyars, migrated into more arbitrary applications. Some chroniclers and later observers complain that punishment became caprice. Neighbors turned against one another. Petty offenses met, in some cases, with disproportionate cruelty. That slide from strategic terror to generalized brutality is one reason why the instrument of power that secured Vlad at first eventually turned many people against him. Fear can bind a polity. It can also corrode the loyalties a ruler needs when he faces larger threats. Which brings us to the tactical arc and its endgame. The forest of the impaled and the scorched earth tactics together persuaded Mehmed II to take a cautious approach in 1462. He did not abandon his capacity to invade, but the campaign's shape changed. The Ottoman army, despite its size and reputation, found its lines of supply threatened and its soldiers confronted with an ethical and psychological pressure, visible suffering that reframed the calculation of conquest. For Mehmed, who was no stranger to bold action, the question became whether the cost of pressing deep into a devastated territory and sustaining a campaign through harassment, disease, and moral rot outweighed the gains. Contemporary sources attribute his decision to withdraw in part to these pressures. Modern historians generally agree that Vlad's composite strategy, logistics denial, night attacks, and spectacle helped make the operation less appealing. Yet it remains important to stress nuance. A one-season withdrawal was not a permanent defeat of Ottoman power or a vindication of Vlad's domestic program. It was a moment where asymmetric tactics and psychological warfare achieved a limited strategic success. The irony is bitter. The very tactics that compelled an invader to hesitate also contributed to Vlad's diplomatic isolation and to the weakening of Wallachia's internal foundations. Isolated, he became vulnerable to palace intrigues, betrayals, and the shifting calculations of neighboring kings. His relationship with Matthias Corvinus, king of Hungary, is a study in transactional politics. Corvinus had his own reasons for controlling Wallachia's rulers, and sometimes found Vlad useful as a buffer. At other moments, he viewed Vlad as a liability. Historical correspondence suggests that Matthias eventually detained Vlad. Officials in Buda held him under suspicion or as a bargaining piece. Editorial cue, according to Hungarian chancery records, contested interpretation. The details and durations of imprisonment vary across sources. Some chroniclers indicate he was imprisoned for months, others for several years. The general consensus among scholars is that Vlad spent significant time removed from power during the 1460s. Exile and captivity for a man who made fear his currency must itself have felt like the culmination of a tragic arc. There are meanings in the reversal. A ruler who turned prisoners into public messages now became subject to the custody of another. But even exile did not end the story. Vlad returned to Wallachia briefly in the mid-1470s. Reports differ on the exact year, and resumed rule for a short period before meeting his end in battle or ambush in late 1476. Ottoman sources report that Vlad's head was severed and sent to the Sultan as proof of his death. This detail appears in multiple chronicles, but, as with many dramatic anecdotes, we should attach qualifiers about provenance. Editorial cue. Reported by Ottoman chronicles. Debated by historians. Whether the head was displayed on the palace gate as some sources claim, or whether this narrative was later shaped for political effect, is debated. Historians mark such claims as plausible in the broad outline, but uncertain in specific ceremonial details. After Vlad's death, memory did the work he had begun in life, but with altered themes. In some Romanian traditions, he became a folk hero, a harsh defender against foreign intrusion. In Central and Western Europe, he emerged through pamphlets and woodcuts as a monstrous figure. Over centuries, his story got folded into myth, and eventually, through a long chain of literary transformations, into the vampire imagery popularized by Bram Stoker in the 19th century. That last transformation is not history, but cultural afterlife. Stoker's Dracula is a figure of fiction, inspired in part by a name and a medieval memory, not by an attempt at biography. Historians treat the Dracula connection as literary legacy rather than documentary evidence. Meanwhile, scholars of propaganda study the Saxon pamphlets for what they reveal about fear, rumor, and political competition in 15th century Europe. Those pamphlets tell us as much about their author's needs as they tell about Vlad's deeds. This interplay, deeds shaping reputation, reputation reshaping political fortunes, is instructive. Public executions and the show of captive suffering created narratives that spread faster than armies. Woodcuts and letters carried images across borders. Merchants and envoys retold scenes with their own inflections. In a pre-modern world where literacy was rising and print culture was new, horrific images were a form of currency. The more sensational the story, the better it circulated. That circulation served multiple aims: to warn, to vilify, to curry advantage. As a consequence, the memory of what happened to prisoners under Vlad is filtered through layers of political intent, shock, and later romanticization. Stepping back, three linked conclusions emerge. First, Vlad's treatment of prisoners, impalement, exposure, forced labor, was a deliberate policy designed to deter and to consolidate. It worked in the narrow sense. It made the cost of invasion harder to quantify and persuaded a major Ottoman army to reconsider certain actions in 1462. Second, that success was costly. The same instruments that deterred external foes, alienated potential allies, damaged the economy, and eroded internal legitimacy, making Wallachia more fragile in the long run. Third, the story complicates simple moral judgments. There is no shortage of horror in the record, and historians rightly refuse to sanitize the violence. At the same time, describing these methods as merely the product of individual sadism misses the political logic that made brutal spectacles an instrument of governance. Why did contemporaries find the fate of Ottoman prisoners so shocking? Because in many respects, Vlad violated a set of practical expectations about wartime behavior. He turned captives into public pedagogy and thereby dissolved the ordinary rules of ransom and exchange. He made suffering visible where negotiable privacy would otherwise have been maintained. That novelty mattered as much as the cruelty itself. A military system depends on certain predictable transactions. By making prisoners and their bodies part of an ongoing performance, Vlad introduced an element of unpredictability that undermined the normal calculations of war. We should also remember the human dimension. The men and women on the stakes, the prisoners sent to Poenari, the families who watched, these were people who suffered under policies devised for effect. When we quantify strategy, we must not lose sight of suffering. This is why historians keep returning to source criticism, to parse propaganda from plausible practice, to weigh numbers and motives, to acknowledge uncertainty while still describing effects. The cautionary end of the tale is blunt. Weaponized terror can achieve short-term aims. It is a lever powerful enough to disrupt even mighty forces. But terror eats at the social fabric that sustains rule. The very measures that turned prisoners into instruments of deterrence could, and did, turn a polity inward and brittle. Vlad's story is therefore less an isolated morality tale than a case study in political technology. A reminder that the tools rulers use to secure themselves often shape the fate of their realms long after the immediate threat recedes. So what happened to Ottoman prisoners under Vlad the Impaler? They were often executed by impalement and displayed where they could be seen. Some were pressed into forced labor on fortifications. Many became part of a staged message aimed at deterring collaboration and breaking the morale of invaders. Those practices altered the expectations of war and contributed materially to Mehmed II's decision calculus in 1462. But they also sowed the seeds of isolation, domestic decay, and a legacy that would be interpreted in wildly different ways across Europe and through the centuries. If this unsettled you, leave a comment. Do you read Vlad as a desperate defender or as something more monstrous? Share the video to keep the conversation going.